A bounced check. You know, it's such a frustrating and way too common problem, right? Well, a recent Supreme Court judgment is about to completely change the game for how these cases are handled. The goal? To bring back trust and, importantly, speed up justice. So, how in the world did one single bounced check lead to a complete overhaul of the entire system? Let's dive in and break down this landmark ruling. So, to really get why this ruling was so needed, let's start with a question. Just imagine this. What happens when a friendly loan, a simple act of trust, turns into a legal nightmare that drags on for almost 20 years? We're talking three completely different court verdicts, and this isn't just some made-up story. It's the real case that pushed this entire issue all the way to the Supreme Court. Okay, so the case is called Sanjabij Tari versus Kishore Borcar. It all started with a friendly loan, 6 lakh rupees, and it was backed up by a check. Simple enough, right? Well, when that check was taken to the bank, it bounced. And what happened next was this insane journey through the entire Indian judicial system. It really just goes to show how tangled and complicated these supposedly simple cases had become. Okay, now just look at this timeline. It's kind of wild. In 2007, the trial court convicts the guy who wrote the check. A year later, in 2008, the Sessions Court agrees. Conviction upheld. But then, 2009, the High Court comes in and flips everything on its head. It reverses the decisions and acquits him. For years, the whole thing is just stuck in limbo until it finally lands in front of the Supreme Court. You can see how this back and forth created a huge amount of legal confusion. So what was the big disagreement here? Well, the first two courts basically said, look, the signature on the check is real. That's not in dispute. Because of that, the law has a default setting. It assumes the check was for a real, valid debt. And they said the accused just didn't bring enough evidence to prove otherwise. But the High Court saw it differently. They started questioning whether the person who gave the loan even had the money to lend in the first place. And that simple question completely shifted the burden of proof. Suddenly, the whole case was turned upside down. And that is the core conflict the Supreme Court had to step in and fix. And fix it? They absolutely did. The Supreme Court's final verdict wasn't just about this one case. Not at all. It was about laying down a clear, new set of rules for every single check bounce case across the entire country. So, what was the final outcome? The conviction was restored. Yep, the Supreme Court completely overturned the High Court's acquittal and went back to the original decision from the lower courts. But honestly, the why behind this is where it all gets really, really interesting. All right, the heart of the matter is this legal idea called rebuttable presumption. It sounds complicated, but think of it like this. It's the law's default setting. When you sign a check, the law automatically assumes it's for a real debt. The key thing is, the burden of proof isn't on the person who received the check to prove the debt was real. No, it's on the person who wrote the check to come up with solid proof that it wasn't. The Supreme Court basically said, this presumption is the bedrock of the law, and we're sticking to it. And the court also cleared up another huge point of confusion. You know how the Income Tax Act has rules about cash transactions over 20,000 rupees? Well, some courts had been saying that if a loan broke that rule, it wasn't a legally enforceable debt. The Supreme Court shut that down. They said no. Breaking a tax rule might get you in trouble with the tax department, sure, but it does not make the debt disappear in a check bounce case. The debt is still very much real and enforceable. To explain just how unique these cases are, the court came up with this brilliant analogy. They called a check bounce case a civil sheep in a criminal wolf's clothing. I love that. What it means is, even though the case is handled like a criminal one, with the possibility of jail time, its real goal is civil. It's all about getting the money back. It's about recovery, not revenge. And this really gets to the bigger picture here. The court was crystal clear. If we don't uphold these legal presumptions, our trust in the entire system, using checks instead of cash, would be, and I quote, irreparably damaged. So at its core, this ruling is all about protecting the trust and credibility of our financial transactions. Now, this ruling didn't just happen in a vacuum. It was the Supreme Court's direct answer to a full-blown crisis that's been bogging down our entire judicial system. Let's talk about the sheer scale of this problem, because it's staggering. In Delhi alone, get ready for this, there were over 650,000 pending check bounce cases. Let that sink in. More than 500,000 cases just completely clogging up the courts in one city. And it wasn't just Delhi, not by a long shot.
Head over to Mumbai and you're looking at a backlog of over 117,000 cases. You can really start to see this isn't a local issue. It's a nationwide pattern.
And then there's Calcutta, with another massive backlog of over 265,000 cases. I mean, when you start adding these numbers up, it's clear the courts were just drowning in a sea of these check disputes.
This chart really puts it all into perspective, doesn't it? When you see the numbers stacked up side by side like this, you realize the absolutely unprecedented strain this was putting on our justice system. I mean, in some places, these cases made up nearly half of all pending trials. The system desperately needed a reset, and it needed it fast.
So the Supreme Court didn't just diagnose the problem, it actually prescribed the cure. The judgment lays out this incredibly detailed, practical blueprint. It's designed to do two things: clear out this massive backlog and make sure new cases get handled way, way more efficiently. Okay, so the court's plan basically attacks the problem from 4 different angles. First, they're modernizing the basics. Things like serving summons electronically through email and WhatsApp, just to speed things up from day one. Second, they're making payments way simpler. Courts now have to offer online options like QR codes or UPI so people can settle up easily. Third, and this one's huge, they're mandating faster summary trials as the default. The goal is to stop these cases from dragging on forever. And finally, they're bringing in accountability with new dashboards to track exactly how fast cases are being dealt with. But that's not all. The court also created a massive financial reason to settle these cases early. They did this by slashing the costs for what's called compounding. That's just the legal term for settling. Under the old rules, if you settled after the trial began, it would cost you an extra 10% of the check amount. Now, it's just 5%. And get this, if you settle before you even have to present your defense, it costs you 0% extra. This is a huge push to get people to resolve these things quickly instead of fighting them for years. Okay, so we've gone through all the legal details, the numbers, the whole story. What does this landmark judgment actually mean for you, for businesses, for the entire justice system? Let's boil it all down to the final takeaways. All right, so here's the bottom line. First, this ruling reinforces that a check is still a trustworthy way to pay. The law is firmly on your side. Second, the whole path to getting justice in these cases is now designed to be way faster and more efficient. Third, there are now much clearer and cheaper reasons for the accused to just settle the case early. And finally, the justice system itself has a real, actionable plan to finally start tackling one of its biggest backlogs ever. And all of this leaves us with one final, really important question. The Supreme Court has laid out the blueprint for a massive change. The new rules are clear, the tech is coming, the incentives are all there. But is this ambitious plan going to be enough? Will it finally restore our faith and, more importantly, speed in the humble check? I guess only time will tell.